It's no surprise that the Highlander world is riddled, or should I say, plagued, with some of the greatest villains ever. From the Kurgan and his vile savagery to Marcus Octavius, the ruler of a post-apocalyptic New York, these evil immortals fighting for the prize and each other's quickening are hard to evade and harder to kill. But what makes each of them unique is how different they all see the game. For some, it's simply a contest to win. For others, it is a lifelong commitment often shaped by misplaced ideals of duty or divinity even. And at the same time, there are villains who aren't even immortals, but are adept at killing immortals. For instance, the Hunters. And in this video, I'm going to explore each of the 35 Highlander villains. But before I begin, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Those two small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these lore lockdowns. And now, let's begin. The Kurgan. Victor, better known as the Kurgan under the false identity of Victor Kruger, serves as the main antagonist in the 1986 film Highlander, and in my view, he is most definitely the worst possible contender for the prize that all immortals seek. He is Connor MacLeod's arch-enemy and quite a brutal, power-hungry warrior who wants the prize for absolute dominion over humanity. And I don't know, man. He could have done some pretty terrible stuff if he got what he wanted. Cruel, ruthless, and megalomaniacal, the Kurgan kills without remorse and takes real pleasure in terrorizing innocent people. He even amuses himself by absolutely humiliating the heavens out of nuns and clergy just for laughs. Because only decapitation can end him, he is pretty reckless in his actions and confidence, whether during his deadly game of chicken on the wrong side of the road or any other stunt that puts others at risk. What fascinates me is how much he enjoys tormenting Connor on a personal level. After murdering two of Connor's closest friends, the two of them come across each other in a church, and this guy mocks his grief for Heather and Ramirez. When he realizes the woman he once violated was Connor's wife, he twists the verbal knife further because he is confident Connor will never break the rule against fighting on holy ground. In battle, he is arrogant, but it was this same arrogance that ultimately led to his defeat.
My new world begins!
Marcus Octavius. Marcus Octavius's name was of course borrowed from the Roman general and senator who once fought against Julius Caesar, but in the Highlander universe, he was the main villain in the 2007 anime film Highlander: The Search for Vengeance. And he's definitely not the brute like Kurgan, but a more polished tyrant-type guy, who serves an ugly dose of cruelty, but is almost always wrapped in noble language. He is an immortal Roman general who once fought for the glory of his people, and in the 2nd century in Britain, slaughtered the clan of Colin MacLeod, and this is how Colin MacLeod became an immortal while his family died. After the fall of Rome, Marcus wandered through history and attached himself to powerful empires such as the British Empire and even Nazi Germany, all with the aim of restoring Rome in spirit. Colin pursued him across centuries and challenged him again and again, yet Marcus defeated him each time. In fact, by 2187, Marcus became the ruler of post-apocalyptic New York. In the end, Colin managed to end Marcus once and for all, but as you can see, it took him like multiple centuries to do so. What really makes Marcus, well, Marcus is his calm sophistication and sharp intelligence paired with insane levels of arrogance. He talks about a perfect society and global peace, but his methods reveal a self-righteous dictator who kills those who disappoint him. Collateral deaths never bother him, and innocent lives hold little value, so much so that he was in the process of making a virus to kill all rebels.
The horsemen were immortals. One of them was called Kronos.
Sounds like something out of the Dark Ages.
Bronze, actually.
Kronos. So we had one from the original movie, one from the animated one, and this one's from the TV show. So Kronos is really a Season 5 monster first and foremost, and his shadow still hangs over Season 6 because Ahriman later uses his image to torment Duncan. In simpler terms, if global ruin had a human face, it would look like Kronos. He is an immortal, the sworn enemy of Mythos, and the living symbol of pestilence among the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Joe Dawson, a watcher who documents immortal lives, once speculated that biblical tales in the Book of Revelation may have been borrowed from people like Kronos, mounted raiders whose real deeds turned into legend and later myth. In the Bronze Age, Kronos led the four horsemen alongside Mythos, Silas, and Caspian, spreading terror across 2 continents. They killed for power and pleasure, roaming lands and leaving ruin behind. At an unknown point, Mythos rejected that life and walked away, which disbanded the group. Kronos believed Silas and Caspian had died, and the horsemen dissolved. After escaping confinement, Kronos adopted many aliases and attempted to build new destructive factions, yet none matched the horsemen's impact. Watchers sent to observe him rarely survived, and he eventually vanished from their records. They assumed he was around 1,500 years old, when in truth he was much older, which also granted him immunity to certain ancient techniques that could otherwise control other immortals. Jacob. The main villain of the 2000 film Highlander Endgame, Jacob Kell was an immortal and once belonged to the same clan as Connor MacLeod, but he later became one of the men who pushed the Highlander to lay down his life to protect those he loved. He hunted the prize like a conqueror hunts a crown, and was driven by power, vengeance, and the promise of dominion over humanity. Kell also became the second great enemy of Duncan MacLeod, and even positioned himself as a mentor and would-be lover to Duncan's former wife, Kate Faith Devaney. What makes Kell really dangerous is definitely his brute force, but also his preference for words, which proves that he would rather do things than speak about doing them. He spoke calmly, often accepting that he did not care about the game, the rules, or the souls locked away by the Sanctuary Watchers, and made it clear that revenge against Connor was paramount to him, with Duncan next in line once Connor fell. He excelled at manipulation and convinced his followers that he was the greatest immortal alive. Before his end, he had taken 665 heads, which kept his name hidden from most immortals, since few survived an encounter. Only the MacLeods and his inner circle truly knew him. He also holds the distinction of being the last known immortal to defeat present-day Duncan in a sword fight. Had he chosen a quick beheading instead of prolonging Duncan's suffering, the outcome might have favored him. Cain. Appearing in Highlander The Final Dimension, Cain was an immortal, and much like his brethren, he was all about cruelty and ambition, and had a long history of violence. Trapped for centuries in the cave of the sorcerer Nakano, he spent hundreds of years cut off from the game, which only elevated his hunger for power. When he escaped in 1994, he had the singular goal of killing Connor MacLeod, and claiming the prize for himself. Born in Samarkand in AD 987, Cain had molded his identity around his childhood idol, the Kurgan, and this pretty much defined everything about him. He grew into a marauder and warlord who tore through regions of Mongolia and Uzbekistan, driven by conquest and bloodshed. In 1023, while ravaging large parts of Asia, Cain suffered his first death from disease and rose again as an immortal, which only made an already vicious conqueror even more dangerous. Cain reveled in brutality, and his behavior had the same sadistic tendencies that once terrorized Connor through the Kurgan. In combat, Cain preferred efficiency over honor. He often sent followers ahead to weaken enemies, then came in to finish the job himself. He trained extensively with the katana, carried multiple blades, and could hurl them with good precision. Additionally, after killing Nakano, Cain gained the power of illusion through the sorcerer's quickening, which allowed him to disguise himself and project false images. Tyler. Appearing in the TV series, more precisely as the main villain in the Season 4 episode titled The Innocent, Tyler King looked at the game as if it was a hunting contract or some sort of an adventure where one could hunt other immortals for kicks. He lived as a headhunter, roaming from place to place, challenged any immortal he located, and claimed their quickening. I see him as a man with a single purpose and some motivation, but maybe not a lot of vision. He tracked Alan Wells to a junkyard, defeated him, and took his head. His next target became Mikey Bello, a mentally handicapped immortal who had lived under Alan's care. His argument was that someone would kill Mikey sooner or later, so it might as well be him. Duncan refused to pay attention to this messed up logic, but Mikey escaped. Anyway, in the end, Duncan prevailed and he left King headless. He is a one-episode villain, so naturally he is not built with the same depth as the franchise's bigger monsters. Still, this is one of those cases where Duncan was never really in danger of losing the story. Kela. Kela used to be a Japanese warrior who fell in battle during the 1500s, but her story did not end there. Marcus Octavius found her, claimed her as both servant and lover, and from that point she pretty much adopted his darkness. So when I look at Kela, I see a fighter who had embraced violence and never thought about resisting it. And although she is simply a secondary villain from the anime Highlander movie, she has what it takes to be a wrathful villain. She gained experience throughout several centuries and developed a taste for killing, which made her dangerous wherever she walked. In AD 2187, she attempted to eliminate Colin MacLeod, and this brought her to Dahlia, Colin's mortal lover. Dahlia mortally wounded Kira, yet she was an immortal, so the moment she revived, she stabbed Dahlia and assumed victory. But Dahlia was not one to go down easily. With her final strength, Dahlia placed a hand grenade inside Kiela's mouth. The explosion destroyed Kiela's head and body, and Dahlia died alongside her. No immortal stood nearby, so the quickening vanished into nothing, which is the only poetic justice fate could offer. Kiela's abilities matched her ruthless nature. She was great at hand-to-hand combat, but if you gave her a weapon, she would use it just right. Malik described himself as more than 1,000 years old, and his history checked out, but what was worse was that he was the leader of a cannibalistic horde from the Search for Vengeance. Over the centuries, he had killed more than 100 immortals, taking their power and building a reputation that felt ancient, even among his kind. By 2187, he ruled a horde of cannibalistic mutants, which is a huge sign that Malik was no ordinary opponent. When Colin MacLeod finally met Malik and his followers, he admitted he had no intention to fight because Malik was not the target he sought. Malik, however, cared little for Colin's reasoning and attacked anyway. His weapon resembled a chainsaw rather than a traditional sword, which placed him outside the usual immortal code. Colin had already taken down several mutants, so when the duel began, he held the advantage and ultimately defeated Malik despite the savage assault. What makes Malik unusual is his fighting style. He rarely used a sword for decapitation, which is rare among immortals. He also bore a mutant appearance, yet canon confirms his age was truthful, which suggests the mutation came later rather than from birth. General Katana. Now, Katana is interesting because he is one of the franchise's strangest big bads. He is not from the 1986 original at all. He is the main villain of Highlander 2: The Quickening from 1991, and the tyrant who rules Zeist in the theatrical cut, or a distant past civilization in the Renegade version. General Katana ruled Zeist with an iron grip, or Earth in the distant past depending on the Renegade version. And I always saw him less as a ruler and more as a tyrant. In Highlander 2: The Quickening, he becomes the immortal dictator whose answer to dissent was force. Connor MacLeod and Ramirez led a rebellion against him, but Katana's troops defeated and captured them. Instead of execution, Zeist's priests judged the pair and sentenced them to exile on Earth, where they would live again and battle other immortals. Katana hated that verdict. He preferred death for them, not a second chance that might one day turn into his downfall. When MacLeod later defeated the Kurgan in 1985 and won the prize, he chose to remain on Earth and age like a mortal rather than to Zeist. Even that decision pissed Katana off, which only explains how much Katana feared Connor. His personality was full of cruelty and sadism, and he often destroyed lives or property for personal amusement. In combat, Katana relied on brute strength and wielded a two-handed broadsword with a hidden extension mechanism, and much like the Kurgan, he preferred overpowering opponents through force rather than finesse.
Hello!
The Guardian of the Source. So he appeared in the movie Highlander the Source, and he's called the Guardian of the Source, so it's kinda self-explanatory, right? Anyway, the Guardian was born as Kind Kron around 12,950 BC, and as you can see, he was extremely old, roughly 15,000 years old, almost like a relic, albeit one that never found any resting place or peace. Around 7988 BC, he joined a quest to discover the source of immortality. That journey failed, and after he beheaded the previous Guardian, the role of the Guardian became his forever. From that moment, protection of the source became his eternal burden, and not a title he could abandon. What makes him different from other immortals is true invulnerability. No weapon, no wound, no ordinary strike could end him. The only way to kill him required decapitation at the exact location where the source manifested, the same act he once used on his predecessor. He also moved at extreme speed, far beyond normal humans or immortals, which turned every encounter into a near impossible duel. Even before his transformation into Guardian, he already possessed master-level sword skill, which explains why he was one of only 3 survivors from a much larger expedition that ever reached the source. Despite all this strangeness, his personality made him stranger still. He was cruel and merciless, yet behaved with odd humor. During his first meeting with Duncan MacLeod, he mocked him with a fake Scottish accent before they clashed. Later, while attempting to kill Reggie Weller, an effort that instead led to Joe Dawson's death, he ran through a graveyard singing "Who Wants to Live Forever," which made him both evil as well as absurd.
A lifelong search came to an end for Professor Jason Landry.
Ahriman. The MacLeods have had to face innumerable bad guys over their long immortal lives, and while these bad guys were mostly immortals, sometimes mortals, Ahriman here was actually a demonic entity, and he was the main opponent of Duncan from Season 5 finale to the entirety of Season 6. So, every 1,000 years, this Zoroastrian demon, Ahriman, returns to Earth to spread ruin, and history records that in AD 997, an immortal named Timothy of Gilliam defeated him. Centuries later, archaeologist Jason Landry warned Duncan MacLeod that he was the next chosen champion against this ancient evil. Duncan doubted the prophecy at first until he began seeing men he had killed, like James Horton and Kronos, alive again. Others believed he had lost his sanity, and the illusion went so far that Duncan accidentally killed Richie Ryan after mistaking him for Ahriman. The guilt crushed him, and he withdrew into a monastery, vanishing from the Watcher records for an entire year. Even Joe Dawson could not locate him. A year later, Duncan returned to Paris, visited Richie's grave, and finally confronted Ahriman, who appeared in the forms of Kronos and Horton. Duncan vowed to end the demon's cycle. However, some guidance came from Sophie Baines, a woman already dead whose spirit led him toward the truth, while Joe and Father Beaufort aided him in the final effort. Ahriman had powers like shape-shifting, telepathy, and psychokinesis, and he often took the faces of loved ones or fallen enemies. His strength fed on hate and fear, and that detail mattered most. When Duncan denied him both, the demon weakened, which then allowed him to be banished and ultimately defeated. Xavier St. Cloud. Xavier St. Cloud's history is also pretty lengthy in the franchise. I say that because he was the main villain of Season 1, the secondary one of Season 3, and then served as an overarching evil force in Seasons 3 and 4. As a character, it won't be wrong to say that he is kinda like the dark version of Duncan MacLeod. I mean, in the sense that Xavier is an immortal who always chose comfort and cruelty over honor, and yet he shares quite a few personality traits with Duncan. He was born in Morocco in 1160 and died in battle in 1192 during the Third Crusade. But his immortality kicked in, and Crusader Henry St. Cloud found him and became his teacher. Xavier returned that mentorship by beheading Henry and taking both his name and his legacy, which is what happens with several of the Highlander villains. From there, his path had the twin objective of power and indulgence. He became a skilled fighter, yet also an assassin, thief, and murderer who chased wealth with no restraint. Mortals, in his eyes, were like insects, which made killing them easy. For much of his long life, he hunted other immortals and preferred seasoned opponents, and even refused an early duel with Duncan because he found him unworthy. His reputation grew so dark that immortals like Hamza el-Kahir saw a meeting with Xavier as a death sentence. Over time, though, luxury dulled his edge. By the 20th century, his focus turned from mastery to pleasure, and his encounters with immortals often happened by chance rather than pursuit. Sword skill gave way to shortcuts, and he relied on poison gas, hired guns, and ambush tactics instead of fair duels. In the end, Duncan visited Xavier at his own mansion, while Xavier was about to relax with a glass of wine. The two fought using a sword and katana, but in the end, Duncan's superior skill set prevailed, and he received Xavier's quickening.
You're a sinner! So's I. I know what it's like.
Alfred Cahill. Despite being a villain, Alfred Cahill's story is tragic because he is someone who mistook madness for divine purpose. Born in London in 1959, even his childhood was pretty brutal. His stepfather beat him in the name of driving out sin, and that abuse ended with Cahill killing the man and walking free. He joined the RAF, trained as an SAS commando, fought in Iraq and the Falklands, and earned the title of war hero. Then a failed psychological exam led to his discharge, and his life drifted toward Paris, where he worked as a security guard at the Templar House Museum. His mind slowly fractured under years of violence, guilt, and trauma. Cahill began to believe he was the voice of God, and therefore untouchable. In 1993, a simple conversation with a prostitute named Claudine turned ugly when she doubted his war stories. Anger flared, a scuffle followed, and she stabbed him when he raised his fist to strike her. Cahill staggered through the streets of Paris and died near a Crusader museum, only to revive as an immortal. Duncan MacLeod noticed him and followed his trail, which eventually led to their confrontation. Cahill's certainty in divine protection failed him, and Duncan beheaded him in the first season's episode titled Avenging Angel, thus ending the life of a man who truly believed heaven itself had chosen him.
Your game? How much is he paying you?
The Hunters. The Hunters were a band of genocidal fanatic xenophobes who basically wanted to exterminate all immortals from the face of the earth. And strangely enough, they were kinda like the Watcher Societies, albeit an evil version of that with crimes like murder and extreme fanaticism. This one was a group that took knowledge and twisted it into obsession. Formed by former Watcher James Horton, they broke every rule their order once followed and decided immortals were not subjects to observe, but monsters to erase. Their belief was that every immortal was an abomination in the eyes of God, and the prize itself had to remain forever out of reach. Instead of silent record keepers, they turned into executioners, and used the Watcher Chronicles as a hit list rather than a history book. Their structure resembled the society they abandoned, though on a smaller scale. One hunter usually led a mission while others handled surveillance and backup. Early on, a failed attempt with Jacob and Irena Galatti taught them a lesson, and they vowed never to behead one immortal in front of another again. What makes them especially frightening and dangerous is that they were ordinary mortals who convinced themselves they served a holy purpose. So it shows their determination towards their cause, and anyone too motivated to a false or misplaced cause must be feared. There are several real-world examples to this, those that don't need my pointing out. Sadly, their most notable victim was Father Darius, a former warlord who had found peace, which proves their crusades spared no one, not even an immortal who had already laid down his sword. Jack Shapiro. Jack Shapiro used to be a Watcher, but he let his grief and authority blur his judgment. A mortal, the highest-ranking Watcher in Europe and head of the tribunal, he also had personal ties everywhere. He was a husband to Shirley, father to David and 2 daughters, former friend of Joe Dawson, and once a student under Ian Bancroft. His fall began when he arranged a trap for Dawson, luring him to headquarters with false news that Duncan MacLeod had died and that a terminal report was required. The tribunal accused Joe of breaking his oath through association with an immortal and blamed him for more than 80 Watcher deaths. Shapiro presided over a sham trial, dismissed Adam Pearson's research, ignored MacLeod's testimony, and then learned his own son David had been killed by an immortal, which hardened his resolve despite no proof against Joe or Duncan. On the morning of Dawson's execution, he left headquarters, unable to watch, and therefore avoided Jacob Galatti's massacre that killed a dozen senior Watchers. Afterward, he again accused Dawson and MacLeod without evidence, and redirected the entire network into a manhunt, a clear breach of Watcher law. When Galatti emerged as the true killer, Shapiro promised parley, used Dawson to draw him out, and personally killed Galatti with a sword. MacLeod received the quickening in front of armed watchers, and Shapiro even tried to attack him before Dawson stopped him at gunpoint. Consumed by his son's death, he prepared the Watchers for war against all immortals, and in doing so he became victim to the very fanaticism the society once condemned. And he's among the very few of the villains who do not die in the show. I mean, not killed. According to the Watchers Chronicles, Shapiro was later tried by the Watchers themselves for nearly bringing down the entire organization, and although he was made to formally leave the Watchers, no further action was taken against him, because it was assumed that the loss of his child was punishment enough.
Give me the crystal.
Luther. Luther is the main villain of the Season 2 episode Legacy and one of the two overarching villains in Methuselah's Gift, along with Nathan Stern, and for him the whole prize thing and his immortal was like destiny that was carved in stone and not really a choice. Trained by Rebecca Horn, yet never trusted by her, Luther received a shard of the crystal she gifted all students, a relic rumored to amplify immortal power tenfold if reunited, and this very rumor became his obsession. He hunted Rebecca's pupils for their pieces, whipped himself with a braid in private rituals, and even burned his henchman Renaud's hand with a hot stone just to prove a point. In 1994, he confronted Rebecca, forced her surrender by threatening her mortal husband John, then took both her head and her crystal. Only Henry Valjean and Amanda remained from her circle. Luther watched Rebecca's funeral, used Renaud to seize Amanda's crystal, killed Valjean without finding his shard, and kept circling Duncan MacLeod, who mocked the crystal legend and refused a fight without the final piece. Amanda later met Luther at the ruined abbey where Rebecca fell, and Duncan revealed he had the real crystal while Amanda carried a fake. Luther knocked Amanda unconscious and dueled Duncan, but fell when Duncan slashed his stomach and beheaded him after telling him that he was happy the whereabouts of the crystals were dying with him.
And the Tsar pays us to get rid of them.
Ian Kristoff. The villain from the third season Highlander episode Testimony, Ian Kristoff drifted through centuries and slowly traded honor for profit. He was born in 1579 in Novocherkassk, Russia, raised among Cossacks, and his first death came in 1612 while suppressing a peasant uprising. After learning about his immortality, he trained under Stenka Bolivin. By 1750, he was living with a Cossack band when Duncan MacLeod entered the scene. Duncan earned their respect after unhorsing a rider, yet conflict followed when nobles ordered the destruction of a farming village. MacLeod refused to take part while Kristoff, then the Cossack leader, pushed him to join the assault. Centuries later, in 1995 Paris, Kristoff had changed into a Russian mobster dealing heroin, though he also pursued painting as a hobby. He used a young woman as a drug mule, and their paths crossed again when she nearly died after a balloon of heroin burst in her stomach, which brought Kristoff and MacLeod face to face in a hospital. Kristoff warned MacLeod to stay out of his affairs, then escalated matters by kidnapping Richie Ryan. The rescue attempt led to Kristoff's chateau. Guards fell, and Richie escaped his bonds. Outside, Kristoff confronted him, dismissing Richie as inexperienced. That misjudgment sealed his fate because after a balanced duel, Richie beheaded him with a Spanish military shell guard rapier, thus ending a 416-year journey. Slan Quint. Slan Quint has the honor of being the main villain in the first episode of the Highlander TV series, and he was an immortal who turned the game into a sport, and I mean that in the most understated way possible. Born in the United States in 1787, he grew up as the adopted son of a blacksmith and learned the trade early. His first death came during the War of 1812 when the British sank his ship. After, Patrick Stans became his first teacher and introduced him to the rules of the game. For a time, he lived quietly as a smith, then the hunter inside him took control. He forged his own sword, a heavy two-handed broadsword with a hidden projectile in the pommel, and began tracking immortals with clinical patience. People started calling him Slan the Cat because he did not chase targets alone. He chased their friends, their families, their peace of mind. He stalked opponents for days or weeks, sometimes kidnapped loved ones, then stepped into duels with a metallic mask that he treated like sacred armor, even though immortal faces healed fast. Quint respected the rules, yet his methods were ruthless. At 6'8", he relied on size and strength to exhaust rivals, and when brute force did not satisfy him, he used ambush tactics or fired that razor projectile for an unfair edge. In the end, Quint was about to land a striking blow to Connor, but Duncan arrived and changed the tide. Quint had to suffer a blow to the chest, so he accepted his defeat and asked Duncan to finish it, which is exactly what Duncan does.
You think so, Frank?
Kenneth. Also appearing in the TV series, Kenneth is an extremely rare immortal because he's essentially a child immortal. He suffered his first death at around 11 years old in 1182, when Normans attacked his peasant village in 12th century England. Soon after, Amanda found him and taught him the rules of the game, but their partnership lasted barely a year. In 1183, Amanda was arrested and hanged, and Kenneth faced eternity alone far too early. From that point, he turned Amanda's words about his innocent appearance into a weapon. I see him traveling through Europe and later America, using sympathy as bait, drawing older and stronger immortals close, then taking their heads. Over 8 centuries, this tactic kept him alive, yet it also filled him with distrust. He believed every immortal would betray him sooner or later, so he struck first whenever he sensed opportunity. In the 1970s, Dalman Ross and his mortal wife Beth adopted him, unaware of his nature. In 1975, Kenneth ambushed Ross for his head. Beth intervened and died in the struggle, and Kenneth escaped, pushing Ross onto a lifelong hunt. In 1994, Frank Brody became a father figure, even taught him how to fish. But Kenneth repaid that kindness with a sudden beheading from behind, thus proving how completely and absolutely survival had replaced innocence. Interestingly enough, despite being a villain, Kenneth was made to escape in the story because they did not want to kill a character through a gruesome death because the character looked like a child. Jacob Galatti. Jacob Galatti appeared in Highlander the series during the 2-part finale, Judgment Day and 1 Minute to Midnight, as a secondary antagonist. He is an immortal gypsy married to another immortal named Irina, and this guy has like a pretty fierce prejudice toward anyone who despises gypsies. His life changed forever after a public hanging over a false accusation of sheep theft. Since immortality lets him revive, he walks away from punishment again and again, which strips him of remorse and leaves him convinced that consequences do not apply to him. In 1847, he travels with a gypsy caravan alongside Duncan MacLeod, who befriends the group. Trouble starts when Galatti and Duncan find Irina assaulted by a local man named Kell. Galatti wants immediate revenge, but Duncan and Irina restrain him and bring Kell before a magistrate instead. The hearing turns into a farce as the magistrate believes Kell's claim that Irina tried to rob him. Kell taunts Galatti, and Galatti responds with a fatal stabbing. The townspeople retaliate with another hanging, yet Duncan secretly moves Galatti so he can revive unseen. Duncan questions whether this revenge honors Irina or harms their people, but Galatti refuses regret and repeats his creed, blood for blood. Axel Whitaker. By now, you must have realized that many immortals see the game as several different things, and for Alex Whitaker, it was like a long con, and his rivalry with Duncan MacLeod runs for centuries. Born in Stockholm in 1567, he has a white streak in his hair, and because he grew up around women, he later turned into a skilled seducer. In 1601, he seduces a minister's daughter, gets shot for it, dies, then revives as an immortal and later trains under Bjorn Gustafsson. From there, he learns that charm can be as sharp as a blade. Whitaker builds a pattern and he recruits young, untrained female immortals, uses them as bait, and lets older opponents walk straight into his trap. In Boston during 1876, he met Sharon Collins and kept her beside him for 20 years without teaching her swordplay. Together, they help eliminate 38 immortals. In 1896, he tries the same trick on MacLeod, falls down the stairs during their duel, survives, then takes Sharon's head after she agrees to leave with the Highlander. Later, he repeats the method with Conchetta Fuentes, nearly 50 more heads, and Rachel McClelland, who dies when Vlad Dobrinsky grows suspicious. In 1994, he targeted Michelle Webster, MacLeod's new student, hoping to settle old scores. MacLeod convinces Michelle to walk away, and Whitaker loses his strongest weapon. Forced into a straight sword fight, he could not match Duncan and finally lost his head for it. Ernst Daimler. Ernst Daimler is the main antagonist of the Season 3 episode Mortal Sins, but more importantly, he's a pretty interesting immortal, in that he is a neo-Nazi immortal, and we do not come around a lot of these guys, do we? Ernst is easily one of the most grounded yet disturbing immortals in the series. During the Second World War, he worked as an SS officer in France and crossed paths with Duncan MacLeod, who was then helping the French resistance. Daimler suspected monks at a nearby monastery passed messages to the British and led a raid with threats of mass murder. A boy named Bernard Sidos stabbed him with a rake. His men fell to a resistance ambush, and Bernard, with his cousin Georges Dalou, wrapped Daimler in chains and dumped him in a river. He revived while sinking and then endured 40 years underwater, drowning again and again before breaking free, which is any day a fate far worse than death. By 1995, Daimler remained around Paris and became a leading neo-fascist voice who produced racist literature. When two of his followers chased an Asian youth into a church, he came face to face with Bernard, now an elderly priest who had learned about immortals from Duncan and recognized him with horror. Daimler pretended to be indifferent about the whole thing, while in fact, he was preparing for revenge. He murdered Georges with the same chains once used on him, and later cornered Bernard inside the church where Anne Lindsay, Duncan's pregnant girlfriend, also stood. He provoked Bernard off holy ground and shot him. When Duncan arrived, their sword fight turned into a fist fight after both of them lost their weapons. But Duncan managed to get his hands on the weapon and take care of the former Nazi animal. Hares Clay. Hares appeared much later in the TV series, more specifically the 5th season. So, by the 20th century, he had lived for at least 900 years and spoke of Carter Welland as a brother-in-arms who served as his squire through 100 campaigns across the continents. Back in 1657, the pair traveled through southern Europe, where Clay even scolds Welland for humiliating a blind duke at darts. Their real aim, however, is Graham Ashe, a famed immortal swordsman. They find Ashe with Duncan MacLeod. Clay challenges him, Ashe sends Duncan into holy ground, and despite Ashe's reputation, Clay quickly gains control of the duel, runs him through, then takes his head and quickening. He even taunts Duncan at the church, calling him a coward and inviting him to face them later at an inn. Later in 1996 in the United States, Clay arrives at a bar to meet Welland, only to learn his friend left with a stranger seeking a fight. He soon finds Welland's beheaded body and spots Richie Ryan riding away. Fury takes over. Clay hunts Richie to his boarding house, attacks and breaks Richie's sword, forcing him to leap through a window to escape. Expecting Richie to steal a new blade from a nearby museum, Clay waits there, admits he wants vengeance over honor, then strikes an electrified Case and ends up stunned while Richie flees into police custody. Later, Clay conducts a quiet funeral for Welland, with Clay as the only attendee. Clay's life finally ends at the hands of Duncan, while Clay was actually waiting to duel with Richie. Duncan injured him heavily, and he fell to his knees. In fact, Duncan offered him a chance to live, but Clay simply said, "It's what we do," meaning he was ready to accept the end of his immortal life. Conwolf. Conwolf is the bad guy you meet at the beginning of the 4th season in the episode titled Homeland, and in many ways he is like a ghost of Christmas past for Duncan MacLeod, albeit a ghost who has lingered for several centuries. He was a Viking immortal who preyed along the Scottish coast for 8 centuries, and in 1624 he killed Ian MacLeod, Duncan's adopted father. Duncan had awakened as an immortal only 2 years earlier and barely understood what he was. He hunted Conwolf down and fought him with Ian's claymore. Now, although Duncan managed to run him through while he was off balance, yet Duncan did not behead Conwolf, I believe mostly because he did not know about the whole beheading thing. Anyway, Duncan kept Conwolf's axe so the Viking would not carry it to Valhalla, and this became the bone of contention between the two immortals for hundreds of years. Conwolf clung to Old Norse beliefs and thought of the axe as a sacred gift. In 1995, he traced a looted cloak pin back to Glenfinnan and stole the identity of Father Laird to search burial records. He hired grave robbers Brian and Kevin McSwain to locate the weapon, killed Brian when threatened to be exposed, and sacrificed Kevin to Odin. Yeah, the same one. Rachel McLeod, a distant clan cousin of Duncan's, crossed his path and led him toward Duncan's trail. Later, Duncan summoned him to the woods, returned the buried axe, and ignited a ring of fire for their duel. Both wounded each other. Conwolf threw dirt to blind him, yet Duncan's claymore shattered the axe staff, and the final strike took Conwolf's head, thus ending a centuries-old vendetta.
Damn, outstanding.
I'm not done yet.
Andrew Cord. Andrew Cord's story really began in 1968 during the Vietnam War, where Cord served as Joe Dawson's platoon sergeant. I see him first as a soldier who protects his men at any cost, even when that cost is too high to pay or downright immoral. He catches one of his troops assaulting a local woman, attempts to silence her with money, and when she insists on reporting it, he kills her. Minutes later, the platoon falls into an ambush that wipes out nearly everyone. Cord appears dead, yet revives and carries Joe, who has lost his legs to a landmine, to safety. By 1995, Cord works as an arms dealer and his moral line sinks further. He sells faulty guns to Maria Leonin, whose rebel allies die because of it. When she refuses payment and threatens his reputation, he kills her as well, only to be spotted by her boyfriend, Charlie DeSalvo. Back in the States, Duncan MacLeod senses Cord's presence at an airport, but Charlie shoots Cord first. Joe then shelters him until he recovers and reveals that he knows Cord is immortal. Cord then started running a paintball center where he enjoyed hurting clients. Duncan defeats him once and spares him for Joe's sake, asking him to stay away from Charlie. Cord breaks that promise and pays for it at the hands of Duncan, and quite interestingly, before losing his head, Cord appreciates Duncan's moves and says, "Damn, outstanding."
Then if you still desire it.
Damon Case. Once again from the TV series, Damon Case is unique among immortals because unlike most who understood what the game was, Damon saw it as his sacred duty, like something that was divine and religious, and that's why he never questioned his choices, because he thought his actions had a divine purpose. Born in Exeter in 961 to a deeply religious family, he first died during the Norman invasion and later met Bishop Leofric, an immortal who became his teacher. From that point on, Case lived by a strong belief that combat against immortals was his only purpose. Friend or enemy, good or wicked, none of it changed his mind. The ritual mattered more than the person. Interestingly enough, like a pious but violent priest, he felt sorrow after each beheading, prayed for the fallen, and still lifted his sword again. So you see, he was not cruel, only inflexible and bound to a narrow view of fate. In 1795, he crossed paths with Jean-Philippe de la Fay III, a new immortal and student of Duncan MacLeod. Case initially refused the challenge, then accepted the next day, and Duncan later found his student beheaded. At a nearby church, Case prayed for the young man's soul and told Duncan to return in the morning if he still wanted battle. Duncan chose not to, realizing anger alone gave him no true cause. 2 centuries later, in France, Case targeted Danny Simoli, another new immortal. Danny fled to Duncan, who tried to reason with Case, yet Case refused to withdraw. Their final duel ended with Case disarmed, offered mercy, and still unwilling to abandon the game, which forced Duncan to take his head.
What will you offer me?
Your head.
And later?
Arthur Drake. Artur Drakov, later known as Arthur Drake, was an immortal who believed his kind deserved power that could be wielded in the open, and was against the secret survival that his kind was living by. And this is what affected every move he made, every decision he took. So he was kind of like a revolutionary, if you will. In 1919, during the Russian Revolution, he ordered the arrest and execution of Countess Abramoff and her teenage children, even after Duncan MacLeod urged him to seize their lands instead. Drakov agreed only if Duncan promised never to fight him unless they were the final 2 immortals alive. Later in Romania, under the name Drake, he used secret police to force resistance fighter Eli Gurel to betray his ally. When Eli refused, Drake arrested Eli's wife and 2 daughters, killed them one by one, and displayed their bodies in front of his store. By 1994, he served as security chief at a Paris embassy of an Eastern European nation at war. He had placed President Chescu in office, then murdered him when peace talks threatened his influence. So he framed a prostitute named Nicole and spread rumors of conspiracy. He crossed paths with Duncan again at a ballet alongside journalist Beth Vaughn and a revenge-driven Eli. Drake wanted to avoid suspicion and kidnapped Beth, with the intent of committing yet another political murder. Duncan finally broke his old promise, confronted him at the airport hangar, and took his head. Drake vanished from records, and the peace treaty finally went through. Michael Christian. Michael Christian saw the game for what it was, simply a means to the prize. His first death happened around 1975, and from that moment his path intertwined with Watcher Rita Luce, who broke every rule of her order to guide him. She fed him information from Watcher records, and with that unfair weapon of knowledge, he cut down immortals for 2 decades, including veterans who had survived centuries. By 1995, he ambushed Mei Ling Shen while she swam, beheading her before she could reach her sword, and I think this pretty much sums up his style better than any duel ever could. Luce kept tight control over him and convinced him he owed her his life itself. At her urging, he killed Jackson Trent, a librarian who had avoided combat for years. Her next target was Duncan MacLeod, who had gone on retreat to a sacred Native American island without his sword. Christian waited until Duncan returned and confronted him on a bridge over a dam. He opened his attacks with a sword but soon lost his weapon when Duncan knocked it away, and then Michael used his martial arts skills he had gained from Mei Ling's quickening. Both men fell into the water below. Duncan retrieved Christian's sword first, and the fight ended there, with Christian losing his head and his long chase for the prize closing in silence. Ingred Henning. Ingrid Henning, a minor villain from the TV show, had her fair share of trauma and guilt instead of the typical hunger for power that immortals usually have. Her immortality triggered after her abusive husband beat her to death, and Werner Tannen later trained her. Somewhere along her long path, she even formed an alliance with Duncan MacLeod, which makes what follows more difficult to digest. During the Second World War, she fought in the resistance within the Third Reich and took part in an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. The attempt failed and her entire group fell apart. Ingrid carried the belief that she had failed to kill a human tyrant and that his rule continued because of her. That guilt shaped the rest of her life. She trained with the Israeli Secret Service and spent decades targeting dictators or figures she feared might rise into tyranny. By the time the episode unfolds, she had already assassinated a Russian dictator who aimed to restore a harsh regime. Her next target lay in the United States, a racist politician who preached white supremacy. Duncan prevented the initial attempt and struggled with the question of whether her intentions justified her methods. The turning point came when Ingrid killed a policeman who blocked her path. From there, Duncan saw that her crusade had crossed a line. When she prepared to detonate explosives in a hall full of extremists, he confronted her directly. Ingrid refused to back down, convinced she fought another Hitler, and Duncan ended the conflict before she could trigger the blast. Grayson. Grayson was once called Claudianus, a simple farmer in Dacia around AD 325. His wife died soon after marriage, and post that, Claudianus's life ended under the hooves of invading Goths around 365. That death brought him his immortality, of course, but it also drew the attention of Darius, a feared Goth general and powerful immortal who trained him into a formidable warrior. Claudianus renamed himself Grayson, and kinda became convinced that Darius was the father he never had, so much so that he even adopted the Grey Wolf insignia his mentor wore. And it was here that his loyalty turned into ambition. He rose to second in command and pushed the idea of an immortal legion to rule the world, but Darius dismissed the dream for years. Their paths crossed Rome in 409 alongside Alaric of the Goths. Grayson grew restless with mortals and despised Alaric, yet fell for Alaric's sister Callistina, who loved Darius instead. During the 410 siege of Rome, Callistina died and was revived as an immortal, and Grayson stayed with her, teaching her the rules of the game and the gathering. When Darius later agreed to build an immortal army, Grayson felt triumph, only to watch Callistina walk away heartbroken because Darius had rejected her, and everything shattered when Darius beheaded the ancient holy man Emrys near Paris and transformed into a peacemaker through the quickening. Grayson saw betrayal, left him, and returned to Callistina, marrying her and taking her as both student and lover. For over 2 centuries they lived together, while Grayson carved a brutal legacy, while he took many heads and rose so high that several watchers believed he might claim the prize himself. Antonius Kais. Antonius Kais, usually called Kalis, is the main antagonist of Season 3 of Highlander the series, and remains one of Duncan MacLeod's longest and most personal enemies. Played on screen by David Robb, Kais began his dark path centuries earlier when he worked with Brother Paul to found a monastery that offered immortal sanctuary on holy ground. On the surface it looked like a noble thing to do, but there was always a trap behind the goodness. Kais followed immortals once they got off sacred soil and took their heads, often by deceit. In 1658, Duncan exposed him, which led to his exile, though Brother Paul prevented an immediate duel. By the 1920s, Kais reinvented himself as famed tenor Antonio Neri, and again crossed paths with Duncan over the same woman. He tried to win through murder, but Duncan intervened and their fight ended with broken glass slicing Kalis' throat, which effectively destroyed his singing voice and left him with a permanent whisper. From that wound grew decades of revenge. He bought an opera house in Seacouver, lured Brother Paul off holy ground, and killed him. After that, he went after Duncan's world piece by piece. First, he framed Joe Dawson with planted drugs, and then Anne Lindsay for a fatal prescription error. Though Duncan cleared them, proof against Kais could not be found, and he escaped. The feud escalated as Kais framed Hugh Fitzcairn for murder and beheaded him before Duncan's eyes. He even killed Watchers Roger Harris and Don Salzer while hunting Mythos. Escaping jail with Amanda's failed interference, he seized a disc containing Watcher secrets and threatened to expose the Order, but the final clash atop the Eiffel Tower ended with Duncan taking Kais' head and using the quickening surge to black out Paris and destroy the disc. Morgan de Stang. Appearing in the Season 4 episode called Double Jeopardy, Morgan de Stang was born in 1783 in Gambay, France, as a foundling adopted by the wealthy de Stang family, and for a while everything looked roses and rainbows for this child. Then Philippe de Stang announced that the estate would pass to Bernard, the biological son, while Morgan would receive only an allowance, and something inside Morgan cracked. That same night, Morgan attempted to smother Bernard, but he failed as Philippe fatally stabbed him to stop the attack. This is when he becomes an immortal and revives in his coffin, only to meet Xavier St. who recognized potential and took him as a student. Morgan wants immediate revenge, but Xavier trains him to be patient. 3 years later, with the Napoleonic Wars ravaging France and British forces closing in, Morgan and Xavier return to the Chateau d'Estaing. The family appears broken and stunned to see Morgan alive. Morgan wanted blood, but Xavier once again counseled restraint, and asked Philippe for the wealth, and to show a degree of civility, Xavier drank some wine with the family. They leave without raising a blade, and only afterward Morgan realizes Xavier poisoned the wine, which means he exacted revenge without any blood spilled or bones shattered. By 1996, in Paris, he worked as a jewel thief and targeted Duncan through traps and poison, and even caused Inspector Dufay's death. Of course, an arrest is what followed, and after one successful staged hanging, he escaped only to meet Duncan where Morgan lost his head and his quickening. Mythos. Now, Mythos is a strange one. I mean, he is one of the most important characters in the TV show, and has even been a mentor to Duncan. In fact, he is widely regarded as the oldest living immortal in the franchise. Mythos and Duncan MacLeod have often walked those paths that an immortal walks through, but more in the capacity of a wary companion than a hero or villain. Across more than 5 millennia, he met several historical figures. Sometimes he even became one, and gathered identities like worn cloaks with Adam Pearson, Watcher Researcher, as his clever modern mask. In one early life, he earned the dark title Death of the Four Horsemen. But instead of dwelling in there, let me tell you something you probably did not know. So non-canon tales say that beings like Kind Kron, the Guardian, Ronaga, the Elder, and Cassandra predate him. Furthermore, in the speculative future of the source, he joins Duncan and Joe Dawson in a broken world, following strange planetary signs and Anna Tashemka's visions to an Eastern European lake, where he faces cannibal gangs on an island believed to be the source of immortality. Now, this story is outside canon, and it's also been called a bad dream. His personality is also pretty contrasting if you pay even a little attention to what he says. He debates philosophy, values knowledge, enjoys company, yet vanishes during grief, as after the Galatti affair and Richie's death. He treats the game with caution, admits he had not taken a head for 2 centuries, and prefers disguises over duels. Still, when friendship calls, he defends Joe, aids Amanda and Richie, and proves loyalty beneath his pragmatic shell. So, I believe I have put him in this list as a villain more because of his past as one of the Four Horsemen than anything else.
A long memory.
You destroyed everything that was dear to me.
That was the idea.
Felicia Martins. The villain of the episode titled Freefall, Felicia Martins, was born as Felice Martins in 1693 in Orleans, France. Here she grew up to work as a prostitute and suffered rape and murder by highwaymen in 1714 before reviving as an immortal. Pierre Bedard finds her, teaches her survival and forgery, then tries to take her head when he grows tired of her, only for Felice to outplay and behead him instead, which is a common trait among several Highlander villains. I mean, they often kill their mentors. Anyway, by the mid-19th century, she got into a relationship with immortal Claude Devereux, and when he left her, she killed his mortal wife and adopted by drowning them in a fountain. Forgery became her livelihood, including works like the Coronelli map of London. And I see a pattern here. Skill mixed with bitterness and ambition. In 1992, she adopted the name Felicia Martins and targeted Duncan MacLeod. She pretends to be a fledgling immortal, convinces Richie Ryan first, then gets trained by Duncan and even receives a prized Masamune Tachi. She uses this advantage to hunt and behead Devereux, yet her own arrogance betrays her when she boasts about forging a Coronelli piece in Duncan's shop, which exposes her entire lie. When she finally challenges Duncan, he uses a technique he never taught her and defeats her with the Italian fencing maneuver Impasse de Sotto. In anger, she makes one last strike, her Tachi breaks, and Duncan spares her head out of respect for Richie, warning her to stay away. She later joins a rock band, falls for immortal drummer Spike, but then her fate remains largely unknown. And as one final bonus mention, I gotta bring up Corda and Reno, Katana's vicious Highlander 2 enforcers, who hit the screen fast and leave a nasty impression. So yeah, that was all in this video, folks. It seems that the Highlander franchise is filled with several kinds of villains. The franchise does not discriminate who the villains are, and you will find people from all walks of life, all colors and genders, but what they have in common is the fact that all of them had options to walk out of their despicable evil lives and start afresh or look for redemption, since they are immortal and can become practically anything. Alas, that never comes to pass, and more often than not, they end up dying at the hands of one MacLeod or another.